I would say that the episode cannot begin unless I introduce him here in our studio. We are talking about the author of the best-selling book, Living to 120. The truths no one wants to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, Adriano Panzironi.
Good evening, everybody.
I really like the little music and I always wait for it to end. So, Mr. Panzironi, are you ready again this evening to tell us one of the hidden truths you talk about in the book?
Yes, this evening we are going to tell a shocking truth. A disease thought to be incurable by official medicine that actually can be cured.
The episode, we said it, is dedicated to Alzheimer's, so we're going to delve into this very dramatic topic for so many people. And I would start by showing a piece of a very interesting documentary called Captain Piston and the Others. Let's watch it together.
Dad, where are you going? Are we going home to Sarah's? Are we going to our house? Without more references, the world becomes foreign, populated by invisible dangers. Did you dream anything tonight?
But I had some kids bothering me.
Ah, did any kids come and how did it bother you?
So,
You want Dad?
but I have to carry the water.
Who to, Daddy?
To this asshole, if you want it, take it. I am not your servant,
Absolutely you do, Dad. You're right, Dad.
Excuse me, I have it. But you have to give it to me, please. Don't bother us. How should I tell you? But how should I tell you?
Dad, but who do you have it with? With this asshole. And who is this asshole?
Is a bastard, we put him inside.
But nothing inside here, the salt drawer, this is now closed.
This rascal is blaspheming all the time.
You leave him alone.
Pig here, pig there. And you leave him alone, not me smash his head. I don't know what to be about. That he wants to put the knife to me, the brain, how many blasphemies give me? 400 billion, 800, or 200.
Dammi 400 miliardi, 800, 200.
Let's leave out tonight.
Yes, we leave it out.
Right? You, because he's a coward.
Perché è un vigliacco.
But who is a coward, Dad?
Vittorio.
And who is Vittorio? Hey, Dad, who is Vittorio?
I don't remember.
My father has never used vulgar words, but the delusions trace exactly what is going on in his brain. He is right to be scared, to feel surrounded.
So, Mr. Panzironi, we saw the piece of this documentary, Captain Piston and the Others, really very touching. This documentary directed by director Mara Consoli, which is really about the director's father. What do you think about it?
Well, I think you chose just a perfect video just to represent Alzheimer's outside of numbers that are obviously catastrophic, and think that the main character of this film is really the director's father.
Look, Panzironi, but this pathology is really upsetting.
But I think it represents perhaps the pathology that scares us the most, because we imagine, in short, some as we get older, we come to lose virtually all cognition. We don't remember the name of relatives. We don't recognize people. Then you really have a deterioration that even induces the inability to manage our own body. In short, really a terrible disease.
Look, this disease, which is unfortunately very widespread, however, was only discovered at the beginning of the last century.
Yes, it was discovered by Professor Alois Alzheimer, who precisely named this disease, and the first case was diagnosed in 1906. To date, there has been a tremendous progression, and today we can talk about a real pandemic.
So I would say, to start our broadcast, our episode well, let's watch this video that introduces us to this very devastating disease. Let's see the video.
Alzheimer's disease can be considered without risk of denial a real epidemic that affects 4,700,000 people in Europe and in Italy, about 600,000 people. To date, the risk of falling ill with this disease is 5% after reaching the age of 65. rising to 25% of people over 75 to 50% of people over 85. Each sick person costs the community €75,000 a year, of which 27% is borne by the National Health Service and the rest by families. We are therefore talking about a total expenditure of about €45 billion a year, of which 12 billion is borne by the state. The highest social cost is the constant effort that family members have to spend to care for the sick person, who unfortunately, year after year, becomes less and less self-sufficient.
Panzironi, alas, the situation is catastrophic both in Italy and in Europe and then worldwide.
Look in the video, the official data were reported, that is that in Italy there are about 600,000 Alzheimer's patients. Actually, I have to tell you that the reality is even worse than the one described in the video.
Here, so let's start with the bad news right at the beginning of the episode. What are you referring to, though?
Look, only a few days ago, the Sole 24 Ore published an article in which precisely it raised the alarm. This was precisely its symposium on Alzheimer's of 2016. Well, only 50% of people are diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So it means that in addition to the 600,000 already diagnosed, we have another 600,000 instead who are sick without knowing they are sick.
So basically, does this mean that we have a much more pronounced progression of this disease?
Yes, the progression is absolutely extraordinary, but I must also tell you that Alzheimer's represents only a percentage of the diseases that involve precisely our brain and degeneration, such as dementia. We are only talking about 60%. So actually, we have in Italy another 800,000 people suffering from degenerative brain diseases.
Look, we have heard of a real epidemic, but this cannot be because the population is getting older and older.
Look, these are always things we are told, and this almost makes us feel comfortable. Actually, it doesn't, because from the 2005 to 2016, there was only a 10% increase in people over 65, while in fact Alzheimer's increased by as much as 50%.
Panzironi, what should we expect from the future?
Well, we should expect an apocalypse. You consider that today 25% of people over the age of 75 are suffering from Alzheimer's disease, 50% over 85. Well, if we will see this progression as we are seeing in recent years. In 30 years, we will be certain to get Alzheimer's disease having reached the age of 75.
So, I would say let's start looking a little bit deeper at this disease, and I would say let's start with the degenerative stages that this disease entails. So we asked our Dr. Maria Immaculata Costanzo to explain what they are. See this video.
The progression of Alzheimer's starts from the hippocampus area of the brain, which is an area deputed to the memory of fixation. Because of this, the Alzheimer's patient has the inability in the early stages to acquire new information, then remember recent things. We say short-term memory, while in fact there remains the memory of things that happened in the past, long-term memory. In the progression of the pathology, then we see all cognitive functions impaired, and then language is involved. Visuospatial functions are involved, then the patient's executive ability until the patient loses his or her autonomy altogether.
Quindi la capacità esecutiva del paziente, sino a che il paziente perderà del tutto la propria autonomia.
In the latter stages, we see phenomena of personality change, thus the tendency even to aggression. The unfortunately painful failure to recognize loved ones, painful on the part of the family who obviously have to endure the problem of not being recognized. In the last stage, you lose control even of swallowing. The causes that induce the patient's death may be the occurrence of stroke or the infectious diseases, pneumonias.
Panzironi, the doctor, explained very well what happens in Alzheimer's patients.
Yes, I think this video gives us a good understanding of what it means for a patient to be diagnosed with this disease, but I think it also makes clear the difficulty of the families who have to follow this loved one who somehow gets worse day by day. So there is not a situation that is always more complicated than the family who follows precisely their loved one.
In fact, you also told us that it is one of the worst diseases that can affect man.
Yes, I use that very noun, man, because actually you should know that there are animals that live much longer than man, such as the elephant, which has absolutely no problems with degenerative diseases in the brain, such as Alzheimer's. So if it is clear that the human race is the only one suffering from this pathology, well, that should make us ask several questions.
So, Panzironi, the disease starts with little forgetfulness that then gradually becomes more and more frequent. We just asked Dr. Maria Immaculata Costanzo to explain to us what the first symptoms are and what kinds of tests can be done to see if we have this kind of disease. See the video.
Figuring out if you have Alzheimer's disease without doing specific tests is still not a simple thing because we all forget. However, if the forgetfulness is very frequent, is severe, then we can think about the onset of this disease. The factors must coincide. So if in the last few months, we find that our loved one very often forgets important things, and then we have to be careful, is it the case to go to the doctor, and that it is the case to do some investigations. We normally proceed with specific blood chemistry tests, and then the cognitive assessment, which is crucial. Cognitive assessment consists of answering a series of questions. These answers will be evaluated. There is a rating scale, and then the evaluation of amnesic ability in a completely objective way. If after these tests the evaluation shows that there is a reduced capacity, then we can do hematochemical tests, blood tests to look for biomarkers, or also do MRI, PT with labeled glucose, all against for beta amyloid, and even go as far as spinal tap.
So, Panzironi, the doctor talked to us. What are the early symptoms, and that maybe should prompt us to do a little more specific tests?
Yes, indeed. Medicine has been doing a lot of work to try to find cognitive tests, examinations that can determine whether or not a person has Alzheimer's disease. But from the pharmacological point of view, so from the treatment point of view, really we are still very, very far away.
However, there are drugs that are prescribed to slow down the disease.
Look, these drugs only work in 20 or maximum 30% of cases and even manage to slow down the disease by a few months, maximum a year or 2 years. In this regard, a big controversy came out in France. I brought an article, if the director wants to put it on, where precisely the French National Health Unit evaluated whether it was actually worth using these drugs. Actually, these drugs have very strong contraindications. They induce cardiovascular problems, neurodegenerative diseases. In short, he ruled somehow there is absolutely no sense in providing these drugs for the result that you get.
So this is the final decision of this body?
The final decision was to advise the French state to no longer have these drugs administered to Alzheimer's patients in France, and in addition, even that it is a waste of public money to load them onto the cost of the National Health Service.
About this topic, Mr. Panzironi, wanted to show you a video by Professor Camillo Mara, because official medicine, of course, tells us that there is no cure for this disease. However, they know very well what are the triggers of Alzheimer's. So let's see in this video. Le cause scatenanti dell'Alzheimer. Quindi vediamoci questo video.
The disease is mainly ascribed to protein alteration of a protein that is beta amyloid. The alteration is mainly the transcription of this protein. This amyloid precursor protein, when cleaved, cut, at the wrong sites, results in the accumulation of a non-soluble form, which is called beta amyloid, which results in the formation of plaques. These amyloid plaques, first in oligomers, then in truly deposited forms, underlie the toxicity. Neuronal and then produce neuronal death with a cascade of events including reduced neuronal function, detachment of synapses, and loss of synaptic connections of neuronal death.
So, Mr. Panzironi, the doctor in the video was really very clear. Basically, the cause is the deposition in plaques of beta-amyloid.
Official medicine has been very dedicated to this thing. It believes precisely that beta-amyloid is the trigger then for the death of neurons, which then leads to Alzheimer's. I have to say that, as usual, medicine takes the bull by the tail instead of by the horns, because what I have read in various studies around the world, they tell us totally different things, namely beta-amyloid is not the cause of Alzheimer's, but it is an effect of Alzheimer's.
Look, Mr. Panzironi, are you telling us that practically scholars are studying beta-amyloid, but still over the years they won't get anywhere?
It's a bit like with cardiovascular disease. It's as if we want to defeat cardiovascular disease by going to eliminate atherosclerotic plaques. Actually, if we want to solve the problem, we have to find out why the plaques form. In this case, we have to determine why at some point the neurons start producing beta-amyloid.
Here, and are there any researchers who are following this path that you just mentioned?
Certainly, I am saying these things because I have read them. It is clear that there are researchers with a different mindset, with a different vision, who are following a different path, the path of testing the absolutely plausible hypothesis that Alzheimer's is a matter of inflammation of brain tissue.
So let us understand. You are basically telling us that we are spending billions on these kinds of research. However, there are some researchers, some scientists who already have answers.
It is a question of approach, because there are scientists who prefer to invest their resources in trying to determine what is the key factor, this element of DNA that once modified starts to produce beta-amyloid and then does not allow its elimination. On the other hand, there are other doctors, other researchers who have a totally different view, as I said, and so they are checking inflammation and then degenerative diseases that involve precisely the brain.
Look, however, I asked myself a question. First of all, why these two types of approaches? Also, why do most researchers follow the first hypothesis and not the faulty gene hypothesis?
So, first of all, the problem is precisely in medicine and research, that each researcher goes his own way. That is, there is in no way a comparison between the various lines of thought, and then there is someone who said that to think wrong is a sin, but many times you get it right. Well, consider that most of the funding of Alzheimer's research is given precisely by pharmaceutical companies that have an interest in finding a gene to repair, perhaps with a drug, and then obviously that drug will be registered and will allow profits to that company. What is different, however, is to get to prove that Alzheimer's depends on degeneration and then actually on our lifestyle and our diet, because clearly from that solution they would find absolutely no benefit economically.
So we know that you usually don't go very lightly with official medicine, and you are confirming that right now. However, at this point I ask you a question. What contribution do you want to make this evening with this broadcast?
Tonight we will try to make our audience understand the real causes of Alzheimer's, and we will try to make them understand especially what are the foods that induce the onset of Alzheimer's.
Perfect. So based on what you just said, our editorial staff did a search and found a very interesting video of Dr. Frisoni that is very close to what his idea is, especially what came out of his research. So I want to see Dr. Frisoni again.
The accumulation of beta-amyloid, thus the onset of the disease, is not in old age, but is in middle age. In the 40s and 50s. Around the age of 40 and 50, amyloid begins to accumulate in the brain, slowly accumulates for tens of years, until the accumulation of beta-amyloid is reached, exceeds a certain threshold, whereby the person begins to become symptomatic, begins to develop memory disorders. The person remains in a condition of isolated memory disorder for a few years, 2, 3, 4 years, after which, with the continued accumulation of beta-amyloid, a second threshold is crossed that leads to the development of disability.
So the doctor in this video basically confirmed what you are saying. So at this point, we start getting Alzheimer's disease practically in our 40s.
Of course, this should make us understand precisely that Alzheimer's is a degenerative disease, precisely because, as it happens with atherosclerotic diseases, we have the episode of the heart attack, which is practically the final part of the disease. It is a poorly treated disease. That of atherosclerosis, which then has as its final effect the appearance of the heart attack, and the same happens precisely with Alzheimer's. We have a deterioration of our brain tissue that lasts for decades, and then we have the appearance of these plaques, precisely of beta-amyloid.
So basically what you are saying right now revolutionizes the approach with Alzheimer's that we have always had. Because you are telling me that when we have the symptoms of Alzheimer's, practically those are not the first symptoms, but we have the full-blown pathology.
But of course, this should make us understand that it makes no sense to talk about a defective gene, because it would mean accepting that nature, when it designed our brain, did it totally wrong. Because if already at the age of 40 we have the onset, let's put it this way, of the early symptoms of Alzheimer's, all this makes no sense.
However, what you say has a certain logic and is also very interesting. So basically, when we have symptoms, we are in the final part of the disease.
And yes, certainly in the final part, this should absolutely stimulate, in short, the medical class to have a totally different approach. That is to be able to try to protect precisely our brain tissue and to understand what are the diseases that instead offend it in some way. And this should also be a problem that each of us should ask ourselves, because if we don't take care of our brain, we will inevitably get Alzheimer's.
So we normally take care of our body by exercising, especially then taking care of our diet. Should we do the same thing with our brain?
Of course, nutrition always remains the firm head of any kind of prevention. On the other hand, it is obvious that for our body, we manage to keep in good condition with physical activity. Well, for the brain, physical activity is mental activity. So always stay active, study, maintain positive relationships with family and other friends. In short, this helps to prevent the occurrence of Alzheimer's.
Look, Panzironi, I have to tell you that you are completely in antithesis, of course, with what official medicine says. In this regard, we have found a video that you will certainly not like. So I invite you to watch it together with me and, of course, together with all our viewers. Let's see.
As Tiziana said, 1 million patients in Italy have doubled in the last 20 years because the biggest risk factor is age. And age has greatly increased lifespan. You know Italy is the oldest country along with Japan, and Italian women reach an average of 84 years old. Average length of lifespan. So what happens? If we consider all subjects over 65 years old, all subjects 4% affected by Alzheimer's disease. 70 to 80 years old. With that range, 12% affected by Alzheimer's disease. From 80 to 85, 35% affected by Alzheimer's disease. From 85 to 90, 60%. If we lived 120 years, we would all develop Alzheimer's disease. Brain aging is invariably pathological, but there is a threshold that varies from one subject to another. If you cross that threshold of alterations in the brain, which are those of Alzheimer's disease, compare dementia. So, if we want to make a paradox, Alzheimer's disease is the limit to man's natural tendency to immortality.
So, Mr. Panzironi, Professor Massimo Tabaton said without half words that if we ever get to live 120 years, we will get there with Alzheimer's. And above all, Alzheimer's is an inescapable disease. So it is pretty much in total contrast to your bestseller, Living to 120, where you tell us that we can still live healthy.
Let's say the doctor is at odds with the data of reality, because there are populations that go up to 100, 110, 115 years, 20 years even, that absolutely do not see the appearance of these diseases like Alzheimer's.
Look, but Mr. Panzironi, what is official medicine regarding Alzheimer's disease doing wrong?
Well, it is doing wrong. As I told you, the obsessive search for this crazy gene that would induce a greater production of beta-amyloid, which then this beta-amyloid is, let's say, the most damaging substance in our brain and induces precisely the death of neurons and the appearance of Alzheimer's.
That's right. However, this beta-amyloid has been discussed for years. However, in the end, we are always at the same point.
Well, I have to tell you that simple are studies that show that our brain, so neurons, normally produce beta-amyloid. Even autopsies have been done to people who died from other causes, elderly people. They found a significant amount of beta-amyloid in the brain, and well, in those people, Alzheimer's had not appeared.
Listen, though, why do our neurons start producing this beta-amyloid after the age of 40?
Well, actually, our brains always produce beta-amyloid, only that past the age of 40, it starts to produce more. It actually uses a precursor, the APP, amyloid precursor protein, cuts it with some secretases, which are enzymes, and the first part of this amyloid uses it for the reconstructive purposes of neurons, and the last part instead uses it for defense purposes against bacteria and fungi.
So you are basically saying that the belief that the excessive presence of this beta-amyloid depends on an alteration of the genes of the neurons should be retired.
But certainly because, as we said before, beta-amyloid is produced normally by neurons, so we have to ask why it is produced in excess and why it is not eliminated as it should be.
So I think you are also going to twist the concept of how to deal with Alzheimer's this evening, or not?
Look, I always tell you I'm a journalist, I'm certainly not a researcher, so I always go back to studies that I've read by really good researchers around the world who publish information like this. Well, these researchers have a common idea. They have an idea that precisely Alzheimer's is caused for so many degenerative diseases, precisely by the inflammation, degeneration of tissues.
There, you said they have a common idea, so what is this thread that unites the research that you read?
That unfortunately our body is absolutely perfect, but we, through our diet, our lifestyle, manage to make, let's say, destroy our body and make degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's appear.
You mentioned lifestyle and nutrition, so here we come to a very hot topic, and also very dear, obviously, to you, Panzironi. So what are the foods that can obviously trigger Alzheimer's?
Well, first of all, the most brain-damaging thing is sugar, so it's obvious that all those foods that contain sugar are Alzheimer's promoters. We talk again about all those foods that are considered healthy by official medicine, even protective against Alzheimer's. We talk about pasta, pizza, rice, legumes, potatoes, corn. Well, these foods are really dangerous for our brain because they contain up to 80% sugar.
So you once again this evening do not want us to sleep peacefully, so I kindly ask you if you can argue these statements of yours a little bit.
Then medicine has long ago determined that there is a correlation between diabetic patients and Alzheimer's patients, and all the more so since Alzheimer's has been renamed type 3 diabetes. This is evident because there is a very close relationship with sugar. Evidently, the diabetic has a higher amount of sugar than the blood circuit. And, well, we know that sugar induces the alteration of the arterial and venous endothelium of our cardiovascular system. And, well, these micro-injuries induce damage to nutrient distribution and inflammation.
Look, so however, how do we connect these, shall we say, circulatory problems with the problem of beta-amyloid accumulation?
As I was telling you, the moment we have an alteration of the endothelium, we also have inflammation, and inflammation creates an inflammatory cascade within the very cardiovascular system that induces the activation of precisely the immune system cells that penetrate inside our brain and then begin to create damage.
Look, our editorial staff has created a video just to show the connection there is between inflammation and Alzheimer's, so then we can obviously argue it after showing it, obviously, to all our viewers. Let's see it together.
The brain is the most delicate tissue in our body, which is why it is protected by the blood-brain barrier, which prevents bacteria or chemicals from entering. Also within the barrier are microglia cells, which make up 10% of neurons and are immune system cells deputed to destroy bacteria and viruses or phagocytize dead cells. Also in the brain are astrocyte cells which structurally support neurons, are responsible for maintaining the proper presence of metabolites in the extracellular matrix, supplying neurons with glucose and eliminating metabolic waste. They also play the role of an immune defense system cell and adhere to the blood-brain barrier to make it structurally stronger.
So Panzironi, nature has taken care to obviously safeguard our brains and has put various barriers to protect that.
Oh yes, our brain, if we go and study it, is really perfect. All the cells are there to ensure the integrity of the neurons. It is just instead the alteration of inflammation that works on these microglia cells that, in short, within the brain, then create an inflammatory cascade.
Here, speaking of inflammation of neurons, can you elaborate on this part a little bit so that we can then better understand everyone?
We know that the immune system is interconnected, so if we have inflammation from one part of the body, we actually stimulate it in other parts as well, in other districts, in this case, even in the brain tissue.
Look, you've obviously talked many times about nutrition and inflammation, so there's always a connection between inflammation in brain tissue as well.
Certainly there is a very strong connection. You consider that we have already addressed this topic of gut dysbiosis. Well, when we eat sugar or sugar-rich foods like bread, pasta, pizza, potatoes, rice, legumes, and so on. In short, these foods induce an alteration of our bacterial form. This leads to the phenomenon of dysbiosis. Dysbiosis hyperactivates our immune system, which is 70% right in the gut, to keep these bacteria at bay. Well, we activate mast cells, which are cells just in charge of killing bacteria, and these mast cells start to produce inflammatory cytokines. The most important cytokine is number 1, which is just the director of inflammation. And then by hyperactivating this, we also go to hyperactivate microglia cells and astrocytes within the brain tissue.
So this is what happens when we basically activate these cells that are present in our brain.
Yes, when we activate these cells, we induce an inflammatory response that also allows other immune system cells to cross over.
Look, however, isn't the blood-brain barrier supposed to protect us from the access of other cells, including immune system cells?
Of course, absolutely. The blood-brain barrier is there for that. The problem is that, however, in inflammation, we have a defenestration of the blood vessels precisely to allow the access of these bacteria that can then go and fight in the extracellular matrix, in this case in the brain. The problem is that inflammation also leads to the disruption of a second barrier, the hematomolecular barrier, and that allows the transfer and passage of cerebrospinal fluid. Well, this fluid is critical because it carries both nutrients to the neurons, but also carries away waste, including beta-amyloid.
Look, this cerebrospinal fluid that you just mentioned is kind of like the lymphatic system for everything else in the body.
Of course, it is critical precisely because it leads to the cleansing of precisely the brain tissue. In fact, some scholars have shown that there is just a very close relationship between Alzheimer's and the malfunctioning of this oral blood fluid barrier. And of course, there are studies that have shown example that people who are less than 30 years old take only 4 hours to eliminate. Precisely this fluid that is perfused in the brain, while older people even take over 10 hours.
So it's kind of like the Alzheimer's patient cannot drain this fluid, the excess of this cerebrospinal fluid, and then the waste from the brain tissue goes to make the accumulation of beta-amyloid.
Yes, indeed, this is what happens, and it is no coincidence that even one of the most widely used biomarkers to determine whether a person has Alzheimer's disease is precisely the determination of the amount of cerebrospinal fluid. In the Alzheimer's patient, we do not have hyperfusion, and this means the onset of the disease itself.
Look, in another episode, we talked about the relationship between stress and Alzheimer's. Is there still this relationship?
Absolutely, there is a very close relationship because cortisol, like nutrition, is able to interact by modifying both the blood-brain barrier and the blood-liquid barrier.
We want to show you a very interesting video regarding stress in correlation, obviously, with Alzheimer's disease. Let's watch it together.
Numerous research studies confirm a close relationship between excess stress and the onset of Alzheimer's disease. In fact, stress activates the hormone called cortisol, which has a direct action on both the deposition of beta-amyloid plaques and the immune system. Its direct action relates to the alteration of the sleep-wake cycle, as its overexpression prevents the production of melatonin and the induction of so-called REM sleep, during which the passage of cerebrospinal fluid increases and allows the elimination of waste in brain tissue. On the other hand, the action on the immune system is directed at the elimination of the system termed Th1, and thus induces the overactivation of the Th2 system and the overexpression of interleukin-1, which is responsible for the overactivity of astrocyte and microglia cells.
So Panzironi, this video told us about the importance of REM sleep, instead how cortisol prevents this type of deep sleep.
Yes, there are very interesting studies that tell us that people who sleep, have a deep and sustained sleep all night long, have the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease as much as 5 times less than people instead who have an interrupted and light sleep.
Look, however, you're talking to us about sleeping at least 8 hours a night. However, I think that's almost an impossible feat, especially past the age of 50.
This difficulty in sleeping has a first and last name, which is called cortisol, this stress hormone, which should be high during the day, and yet in the evening, around 8 o'clock in the evening, it should, in short, go away, and another hormone should start, which is melatonin, which then allows the reconstruction of all our tissues, and also the functioning of the hematolic fluid.
Look, however, Panzironi, let us understand for a moment why not sleeping at least 8 hours a night is an obvious cause for the onset of Alzheimer's.
In our brain, we have cells that are called glial cells that somehow support the neurons during the day, so they are structural. However, at night when we sleep and we have REM sleep, actually these cells shrink. By shrinking, they allow the passage of this cerebrospinal fluid, and so it allows us precisely the cleaning of the waste, and then also take away the amyloid beta.
So basically, if one doesn't sleep properly, let's call it that, obviously there could be these issues of not cleaning, and then the beta-amyloid could remain.
You may have noticed, if you did maybe some late nights, maybe you only slept 2 hours, that the next day you have circles in your head, headaches, a heaviness, and well, that is due to the waste that our brain failed to eliminate in time. Consider that if we don't sleep for a number of days, we even go into a coma.
So then, we have to live a more peaceful life and obviously more regular life.
We have to live a more serene life, and then we have to do a different diet, because unfortunately the diet of bread and pasta, pizza, potatoes, rice and legumes inducing glycemic dips and inflammation then also leads to the overexpression of cortisol and then the problems we just expressed.
Look, however, Panzironi, you up to now have basically described to us a dramatic situation, because then anyway medicine has repeatedly said that you don't regress from Alzheimer's, but more importantly you don't get cured.
In fact, for medicine, the Alzheimer's patient has no way out. He will absolutely have to get to what is the final outcome, which is precisely death. Instead, I have to tell you that I have hope, because I believe that if people do the right supplementation, and well, they can stop this progression of the disease, and even one can even think of regression. I brought you a video of Professor Dore, who is a really very, very good neuropsychiatrist who has done experiments and is regressing some Alzheimer's patients.
So I would obviously invite the director to send this video. Thank you.
All the disciplines that have been talking about the mind-body relationship and therefore have been interested in the influence of the mind in particular on the body have had to, as it were, give up their arms a little bit in the face of so-called biological evidence, as in, say, where the structural damage is, there is no more possibility of intervention through the mind. Now, what we will see instead will be a literal opposite verification of that belief, in which it will be confirmed that the mind, if subject to a certain specific stimulation, and thus remains again at that particular condition of consciousness related to the logic and language station, and thus to symbolism. Allows a certain overcoming of the limits that until now have been considered limitation.
The SPECT was done in nuclear medicine to see the second image totally with so-so metabolic recovery, as seen in the thesis and as also seen in the book. We were all delighted because for the first time I saw a restitution ad integrum, as they say, that is a functional recovery, both clinically, but also the images were pretty much congruent with what was seen clinically.
It was years Mom who did not go shopping at the market close to home, but close to home 300 meters away. At this point, we decided precisely to do these tests at the St. Camilla Center, which of course gave the diagnosis anyway of cerebral hyperperfusion, cognitive impairment, and brain atrophy. In short, after 3 months, she basically started slowly eliminating the antidepressants that she was taking. From 10 years at least. After a year she has... Let's say she resumed her normal life.
Mr. Panzironi, here Dr. Dori seems to demonstrate that with some intellectual exercise, one has succeeded in regressing a lady from dementia.
This Professor Dori is demonstrating a very important thing, that our brain is capable of self-repair if it is put in a position to do so.
Look, however, we have always been told that neurons are the only practically cells that do not reproduce.
Unfortunately, official medicine creates dogmas and then also remains hostage to them. In fact, official medicine itself has proven that this is not the case. I give you the example of people who suffer stroke damage. Well, with rehabilitation, they are able to reactivate limbs, perhaps that were paralyzed, and this is because they have re-stimulated precisely the growth of the part of the brain tissue that was dead.
However, medicine tells us that this depends on muscle reactivation and not brain reactivation.
Yes, look, also this is really an amazing thing in official medicine. Look, I brought you a picture of a person who I think is extraordinary, Carlo Perfetti. Here he is, this extraordinary neurologist who already in the 1980s showed that doing precisely rehabilitation, not only from a physical point of view, but also with cognitive exercises, led to extraordinary results. Just think that this doctor opened schools all over the world, and all over the world people study the Perfetti method, and in Italy it is even unknown. So imagine that we still continue to do rehabilitation only in the motor aspect.
However, both Dr. Dor and Dr. Perfetti used this new method, so how is it possible?
It is very, very simple. We have so-called stem cells that are produced in any part of the body, including in the brain, and then the brain starts to duplicate these stem cells that go to replace the damaged neurons, restoring the cognitive situation or the precisely physical alteration that has been altered.
Look, however, Mr. Panzironi, if everything was so simple, there would be no problem, obviously, for these degenerative diseases.
But I did not say it is simple. I tell you it is possible. The problem is that the Alzheimer's patient has a highly inflamed tissue, and we know that when there is inflammation, the body cannot heal itself, so it cannot implement all those mechanisms that are needed for its healing.
It's kind of like what happens when the inflamed tissue doesn't repair itself so that the inflammation doesn't go away.
These are rules that apply to any part of the body, including the brain. So it is obvious that we have to have two factors. On the one hand, a reduction of inflammation so that we restore, let's say, the balance within the tissues of the brain. And then we have to stimulate the damaged part with cognitive exercises that can precisely tell our body that we still need that part of the brain.
Look, though, let's go back for a moment to what is within our competence. Can nutrition do anything?
Nutrition can do so much because through nutrition, therefore by eating sugars, we induce inflammation, we induce destruction of microcirculation, and therefore directly the onset of Alzheimer's disease.
Look, regarding vitamin C and vitamin D, we are very well informed, thanks to you, that they obviously help the immune system. While you just added omega-3, what do they help us with?
So first of all, vitamin C also has another function, which is the reconstruction of the arterial endothelium. we have seen how important the microcirculation is in order not to induce the damage to the neurons and therefore the occurrence of Alzheimer's disease. And well, vitamin C is crucial for that and to thin the blood. With regard to omega-3, we know that the included cells or neuronal cells use omega-3 to build their membrane. And well, when we are deficient in omega-3, we have an excess of omega-6. This induces a greater production of inflammatory cytokines, which are then also the basis of tissue inflammation.
Look, you also told us about free radicals that seem to be too much in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. So if we, to prevent it, take antioxidants, could this help us?
Certainly. Consider that several studies have shown that in the Alzheimer's brain we have a reduced amount of glutathione. Glutathione is an endogenous substance that allows us precisely to annihilate free radicals. And unfortunately, in the Alzheimer's brain, we have a lot of free radicals because the immune system produces them. So when we have inflammation, we also have hyperactivation, a huge amount of free radicals. Clearly, if we use antioxidants that are able to penetrate the blood-brain barrier, such as resveratrol as well as curcumin, well, that allows us to stop those free radicals that are so harmful.
Look, though, how do these substances work to protect our brain, obviously?
On the one hand, they give up the electrons, so they turn a free radical into a normal atom. So it ends that inflammatory phase of alteration that are the basis of free radicals. And then resveratrol even has the ability to rebuild the walls of the endothelium, so of the veins, of our arteries, and then even curcumin, which is extraordinary because it inhibits the production of interleukin-1, which is that inflammatory cytokine that, precisely as we were saying before, is the director of inflammation.
Look, Mr. Panzironi, we basically finished the first part of our program where we went into this very dramatic pathology. But we have added a small part, a few minutes, because just last night I know that you learned about a news that was what I was then telling our viewers, really shocking, about a medical protocol that you tested on 10 patients and achieved a regression of Alzheimer's.
As you say, from a journalist point of view, it was a tip. One of my listeners, knowing that I was going to talk about precisely Alzheimer's today, sent me this news last night that I honestly had missed. Well, this University of California created a protocol, applied it to about 10 people, and had a major regression of Alzheimer's. Well, this protocol involves a change in diet, better night's sleep, of course. It involves targeted vitamin supplementation. It involves physical activity, and it involves cognitive exercises.
Basically everything that you have told us this evening.
Yes, actually, I prepared this episode. She reiterated in full what we this evening confirmed in short. And finally, I am very happy about that. There are doctors who don't just think about finding the crazed and damaged gene, but instead ask the right questions and then also find the right solutions.
Adriano Panzironi, l'autore del bestseller Vivere 120 anni, che è stato qui questa sera a parlare con noi dell'Alzheimer. Grazie mille. Thank you very much.
Buonasera.